We want to welcome you all tonight. My name is Charlene Margot. I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture that is bringing you tonight's program, Building Bridges, Neurodiversity-Affirming Practices for Parents and Schools. Welcome, Amanda and Emily. Take it away, ladies.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am trying to do the thing where I share my screen and talk at the same time. So Emily, if you want to vamp for a minute while I do that, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so I was not prepared for
Okay.
just filling.
Okay. So I think one of the things I would start by saying is one of the things Emily and I do when we have conversations is we truly just have conversations because we really believe that conversation is where you start building those bridges. So tonight when we speak with you, that's what you're going to be seeing us do is have a conversation. We're going to bring you into the conversation. We're going to bring ourselves and our different perspectives into conversation. Emily and I come from similar and different backgrounds, which means we bring two different perspectives to the work that we do. I like to put up our pretty pictures because these are the pretty pictures that you don't always get to see in real life. I mean, we hope we look like this. But again, I'm an author, an educator, I'm a behavioral specialist. I'm actually here on the peninsula. That's where I live now. And I'm also the director of academic services at Compass High School. And I'm just so delighted to be able to be the co-author of this book with Emily.
Yeah. And so I'm Emily, and I am a licensed professional counselor, but Amanda and I both have backgrounds in education. So I started off as a teacher. I worked as a school counselor. And so with my work, I kind of come at this from that mental health angle as well as just from that educational piece. And also I'm the parent to 3 neurodivergent kids. They're 15, 17, and 10. I don't know why I said the ages in that order, but
Well, and I'll add that I'm also parent to 3 neurodivergent. Now I call young adults. I have to stop saying kids. They're 29, 23, and 15. So now you threw me off, Emily, because I was trying to think in what order to do that. But I think what that says is when we have these conversations, we're coming at this from so many angles, from a counseling angle, an educator angle, a parent angle. And we want to know that we are aware that communication and building those bridges is just a hugely important part of working together. And I'm going to start with learning goals because as an educator, that's what I always start with. Emily, I'm going to slide these in here first. We want to make sure that you understand the concept of neurodiversity in a strength-based lens. We want you to gain practical tools to support collaboration between parents and schools because collaboration is where we start building those bridges. We want to explore how curiosity can shape advocacy and strengthen relationships. And we want to make sure you gain practical tools to support collaboration between parents and schools. Emily, what would you add to that? Anything?
no, I think that's everything. And, but hopefully, again, I think the big picture here for our goal is just thinking about what do our neurodivergent kids need and how do we help advocate for them in a way that is collaborative with the schools and actually will help leverage our kids' strengths and help them be successful. Sometimes I feel like people feel like the parent school dynamic feels adversarial, and it shouldn't, and it doesn't have to. And hopefully, we can brainstorm just some approaches to help that be a smooth transition and a smooth way to communicate.
Yeah, and so for us, the big idea that we wanted to sort of explore today was how can we being parents, educators, professional clinicians, even students themselves, especially students themselves, how can we lead with curiosity in our advocacy to build these more productive relationships and create positive change? And one of the reasons is because we really believe that curiosity builds trust and collaboration, that advocacy is shifting from that potential confrontation to partnership, and that brings us to better outcomes for all kids. And so this is the big question that we would love you to keep in mind as we go through this conversation. One of the things that Emily and I decided is we're going to have fewer slides and more conversation because I think sometimes we spend a lot of time with slides and asking people to read the slides and listen to a conversation at the same time. And you know what? It's not something I would ask my neurodivergent students to do. So I decided it's not something I'm going to ask all of us to do tonight. So please do feel free to put things into the chat. And I'm going to open with this first question, which I think Emily and I are going to talk about, but I'd love to see your thoughts too. The first question being, what is neurodiversity? And so I'm going to wait and see if anybody has thoughts for that in the chat, and then we'll start our conversation about it.
Yeah. How would you define it? What does it mean to you? You can
Yeah.
talk about it as a concept or whatever might work.
Yeah. So I'm trying to see the chat, and I'm hoping that nobody's seeing my chat open at the same time. This is a screen share kind of thing where I'm wondering that. Emily,
No, we don't see it.
Emily, how would you define neurodiversity?
So I would define, well, I'm gonna give it just 1 minute for people to
Yeah.
maybe put those things in the chat a little
Yeah.
bit because I don't want to just. So I see different ways brains are wired, the idea that everyone thinks and processes differently. Everyone's brain is different with different needs. Validate that everyone has different ways with our brains. Diversity of neurotypes is a natural variance.
Mm,
Um, different behaviors due to unique wiring, different strengths, and different strengths. That was, I think, an add-on from
yeah.
earlier, maybe. So yeah, I love these and keep them coming, and we'll kind of, you feel free, you can add some other thoughts as we go through. When I
Mm,
think of neurodiversity, specifically what I think of is I align it as a comparison to biodiversity. And so we know that biodiversity is this idea that throughout the entire world, we have all of these different species and they have all of these different traits. And those traits, that variability within species actually is a benefit. It helps them to survive, you know, when we
mhm.
think about you know, those different characteristics that they need. And so neurodiversity is kind of this comparison, right? Like we have all types of different brains. We have all types of different approaches to different things. And that's a benefit. We need people in this world who see things differently, who approach problems differently. Amanda, what would you add there?
I think I would add that when we're talking about neurodiversity, Emily and I, when we were writing the book together, made a distinction between neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And so you'll hear us talk about that tonight. And it's a very intentional distinction because neurodiversity, just like biodiversity, includes everybody. Everybody watching this now, everybody watching this later, everybody in the world is neurodiverse, right? They have different brains, different ways that they approach things, different ways they think. When we're talking about neurodivergent, we are talking about brains that obviously are wired in their own way, the neurotypes that may make accessing something in the world a little more challenging. It may mean communication is a little more challenging. It may make learning a little more challenging. It may make processing or output or input a little more challenging. And when I make that distinction, I'm talking about the difference between neurodivergent brains that are struggling because of the way the world is set up and their brains are interacting with the world, not because there isn't something inherently wrong with the way that brain is. And I say that being a neurodivergent person myself. So I just want to make it clear that when I'm talking about neurodiversity, I'm talking about everybody. And actually, when I'm talking about neurodiversity affirming practice, I'm really talking about practices that do support everybody, but that are especially supportive of our neurodivergent, I want to say students, but everybody, supportive of all neurodivergent brains. Yeah.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah. And I think maybe it would be helpful to talk a little bit about how we define neurodivergent. Like, what are we talking about when we are talking about neurodivergent? And Emily, you do
Yeah.
this so beautifully. I'm going to ask you to step in.
Sure. Yeah, again, when Amanda and I were writing our book, we really did have to create some sort of parameters for what we were really talking about. So for those of you, if you are super involved in the neurodiversity community online, there's often a lot of discussion about what labels do or don't fall under this umbrella of neurodivergence. And so as far as what Amanda and I are thinking about, especially when we're talking about in schools, about how to approach things with a neurodiversity affirming lens, there are some specific kind of diagnoses or identifications that we consider part of being neurodivergent. So autism, ADHD, intellectual disabilities and cognitive giftedness. So then also twice exceptionality, which is that layering of giftedness and another disability, if you're familiar with it, with that term. Dyslexia, dyscalculia, all of these things that are really about ways that the brain really processes information, understands information, communicates or learns. And these are things that are pretty pervasive throughout the lifespan. Somebody who is dyslexic is always going to have a dyslexic brain. They may learn a lot of different coping skills or strategies in order to compensate for that, but ultimately their brain is always processing that language a little bit differently than other people do. And so we need to take this into consideration. So when I think of neurodiversity affirming practices, especially when I'm talking about my counseling practice, I approach it in a very specific way. So you'll notice the labels that I didn't include there are things like anxiety and depression, because I consider those more kind of like psychological or mental health diagnoses. Those are part of neurodiversity, but not necessarily part of neurodivergence. And the reason that that matters is because when I think about being affirming as far as an approach for how we support somebody, if I have a client who comes into my office and they are dealing with, say, anxiety, my goal is to make that anxiety go away. As a matter of fact, if you are affirming or accommodating, depending on how you're using that term specifically, but if you're affirming or accommodating to that anxiety, often you're just going to make the anxiety worse. But anxiety tends to be episodic. It can be treated. It can go away, hopefully, if we are successful. And that's not to minimize the fact that many people do experience chronic anxiety throughout their lifetime, which does impact them in many different ways. But when I have somebody who comes into my office and they are autistic, when I think about an affirming approach there, my goal is not to make them not autistic. My goal is to affirm the fact that their brain works differently, and I am there to help them navigate a world that wasn't created for them. How do I operate? How do I show up in this space? How do I access what I need to access and live the life that I would like to live um, within the way that my brain works? And
Right.
so that is really kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about neurodivergence. But again, as Amanda said, practices that are neurodiversity affirming are not just good for neurodivergent kids, they're good for all kids. And that's not to say that any of those other labels might not need accommodations or supports.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I love the way you do that. That's why, and when we're talking about those variations, you'll notice that the two of us, and I think this is important when we're talking about building bridges, right? When we're talking about shared language and shared understanding, the two of us default to identity first language, which means we'll use words like dyslexic and autistic. We also know there are plenty of people who use people first language, person first language. So a student with autism, a student with dyslexia. We are not placing judgment on one more than the other. It's just, for me, I use autistic because I can't separate the variation of my brain or those of my children from who they are as an identity, right? So I just want to sort of level set there. And you'll notice too that I just used the word variation, right? And to some degree, and I'm trying to figure out sort of how to frame this, right? The framing of differences as variation instead of deficit matters so much when we're having these conversations, especially when we're starting to have conversations amongst ourselves, because when we talk about deficits, we're only sharing what kids, students aren't able to do well, right? And that's only a part of the picture of when we're talking about students. Yes, there are things that they're not going to do well, but there are also things that they are doing simply differently than you might expect, right? So for example, the way that I communicate is very direct, right? I'm very often saying exactly what I mean. There are other people who aren't as direct in their conversation and they sort of go in, as a student said to me today, a little more softly, which I really kind of loved, softening it a little bit. And those are variations. I don't have a deficit in being able to soften my language. I just have a variation in how I use my language. The variation piece really matters because when we move to a deficit thinking model, it really sort of promotes stigma and exclusion, right? But the variation lens really looks at those strengths and the possibilities, and shaping our language certainly helps shape our expectations, and it shapes the support that we are giving to students.
I love that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I love that too. Wondering if anyone else has thoughts too. I really want to keep seeing the chat. I'm seeing all the emojis come up, and I'm loving that you're all sort of interacting. When you think of deficit-based language, what does that sound like to you? I'm super curious to see if people have examples, because it's really easy to come up with examples of deficit-based language. It's sometimes harder to come up with strength-based and variation-based language. I see somebody
You know,
saying we need,
it's,
yeah. Go ahead, Emily, please.
I was just going to say, I was working earlier today. I was working earlier today on a presentation I'm giving tomorrow morning. Shh, don't tell anyone. No, it's actually more of a workshop type of thing, but it doesn't matter. I was texting with the representative that I'm working with there, but we were talking about how they're really working to shift a lot of their language and some of their terminology that they have in their behavior matrix specifically. And it's a lot of things like being disrespectful, right? Well, when you talk about being disrespectful, that's subjective. How are we defining that? And what one person might perceive as disrespectful might be just that variation as far as how they communicate. Or what was another example? Even
seeing
just
some
talking. Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
seeing some
Yeah,
good I'm
jump
seeing
in.
some good ones in the chat too, right? I'm seeing things like
Perfect.
the why you can't focus. Why can't you focus? What's wrong with you? Difficulties, challenges, shortcoming. I think shortcoming is a really interesting deficit word because it implies that there's a way to be, right? And that deficit, that deficit has a negative connotation. So I can't even keep up with the chat. Thank you so much, everybody, for this.
Yeah.
But I also think, for example, I think disrespectful is a really good example of a deficit-based. I think oftentimes, I think just the word can't becomes a deficit-based. Can't read, can't do math, can't. And if we give that sort of deficit perspective when we're saying somebody can't do something, it doesn't leave open the possibility that they can. If they can't read yet, what can they do? I could have students when I was teaching in the younger years who were not yet able to read, but they were able to rhyme. They were able to do, they had phonics and reading readiness skills. So being able to explain to people that there are things that people are able to do. I don't necessarily, I like this comment. I don't think that deficit language necessarily leads to harsh language. I strongly believe that that these are disabilities, but still keep an open language. I would agree with that too, right? I think one of the things that's important, and Emily, please jump in if you disagree or want to say something different. I think one of the things that's really important is to recognize that deficits still exist, right? And when we're talking about this, we're making sure that we are acknowledging both strengths and struggles, because we don't want to erase the idea that there are these struggles. So I appreciate that comment because I think it's really important to
Yeah.
acknowledge that as well. Yeah.
No, yeah, I would just add there specifically thinking about disability is not a dirty word, right? We can call something what it is. As a matter of fact, one of the big pushes of the neurodiversity movement really is about destigmatizing those labels. Like, let's just call something what it is. So that way we can help people get the support and help that they need. But when I think of deficit language too, though, the other thing I'm thinking about is, again, those terms that are I saw somebody put in the chat something about lazy, right? Or they're avoiding tasks, or, instead of avoiding tasks, what if we said difficulty with task initiation? It's just a more neutral term there. And so that really does influence, again, how we approach it. And so what are those subjective terms, again, that separate people and give just that connotation? Part of the reason why I come back to this over and over again when we talk about this, and we can kind of move on
Yeah,
from the language
sure.
stuff too, but I will just share, as a mental health clinician, we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. Take it or leave it, like there's pros and cons to it. However, the premise of cognitive behavioral therapy is the idea that there's this influencing factor between thoughts, actions, and emotions, and that each of those influence the other. And so in CBT, what you do is you try to shift somebody's thoughts, the words that they're saying, that they're thinking in their mind, in order to then reframe or shift their emotions and then influence those behaviors or those actions. And so when we shift our language, it influences how we feel about things, how we approach things. And so if I think that a student is lazy, or if I think that they're struggling with task initiation, I'm going to approach those in two very different ways. And so that's really why it's important to move to that neutral language that is descriptive as opposed to anything that is value laden.
I love that. I love that. And I think it leads us really nicely into sort of this next question, right? So as we're talking about this, and I think, this how parents can create supportive home environments for neurodivergent kids. And I think that these are tied together, right? As a parent of neurodivergent kids myself, as a parent to neurodivergent kids myself, I'm trying to make sure my language is appropriate and succinct here. I have evolved in how I think about how I talk about my own children, right? Even as a professional in this field. So I have a child with I have two autistic sons, one of whom also has ADHD. So he's an ADHDer, and my other one is autistic and twice exceptional. Even being in this field, it's been hard for me to realize, how do I meet their needs? Because their needs are different. How am I supportive? How am I making sure that I am really meeting the kids that I have? And I think part of that has been hard. And I think for many parents, it's hard because we do a lot of comparison, right? I think parenting comes with a lot of should haves. I wish I had. It comes with this sort of internal dialogue of what I should be doing or who I should be parenting or those kinds of things. And one of the things that I think a lot about is, how do we respect the individuality of our kids? So, for example, when my older son decided he wanted to use the phrase autistic for his own identity, I didn't assume that my younger son also wanted to use that phrase. I wanted to make sure to ask him. I wanted to make sure that I was supporting him in the way that made the most sense. I also spend, a great amount of time. There are times when one of my kids will be sort of zooming around and I'll ask them to do something, perhaps brush their teeth or get into the shower or that kind of a thing. And 5 minutes later, I'm saying, why haven't you done that yet? Right? Or where are you? Or which to some degree I think is appropriate at a certain age. But when I'm realizing my child is missing that information once they get down the hallway and they're like, I don't know exactly why I was here. There are times where I'm thinking, why can't you focus? And then my answer to myself is, oh, because you're having trouble focusing, right? So creating that supportive environment for me is about shifting my own perspective, shifting my own language. And I also think just using that strengths-based language helps me build routines, be more
Mhm.
flexible, right? Normalize each of their needs, that kind of a thing. Yeah. Emily, what would you add when you're thinking about supportive home environments? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, you mentioned about being neurodivergent. I'm also neurodivergent. I was actually diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid, which is pretty rare for women my age. I was diagnosed when I
Yeah.
was in fifth grade. And and I know that growing up for me, whether it was at school or at home, the strategies that were used to help me were discipline,
Mm,
consequences. Like, as if I had this, if I didn't do something and I lost a privilege, that somehow I was going to learn to do that thing. And throughout my lifetime, and part of the reason why I came into this work is because I realized that didn't work. And in many ways, it caused more difficulty and more harm than what it was hoping to do. So when I approach this and I'm thinking about the areas that our kids need support, whether that's at home, at school, in the therapy office, whatever it is, I always focus on the fact that while consequences may get short-term compliance, they do not teach a skill.
hmm
So if you have somebody, and somebody, I saw somebody mentioned Ross Green in here, but this is kind of, one of the foundational things that he talks about. It's like, kids do well if they can. If kids are not able to do something, something is missing. And so how do we figure out what that missing piece is to give that support? And so there are a lot of different ways that we can approach that, but that's often, and I will even say as a parent, so my oldest is 17, even as a parent, that has evolved so much over the last almost 2 decades, to really realize, like, how do I break this down here at home? How do I help with what they need to do, and provide supports? And I also just want to really validate that it's hard just being a parent. It's hard being a parent to a neurodivergent kid. And especially if you're also neurodivergent, it's hard to be a neurodivergent parent to a neurodivergent kid. Like there are a lot of competing needs and competing skills in all of those situations. And so just to validate the fact that it is really hard, and there will be some days that will go better than others, and that's okay.
Well, and it's interesting. In our house, we just call our house Neurons Gone Wild because we are all neurodivergent and it all interacts in interesting ways. And I'm seeing the consequences may get short-term results, but they don't teach a skill is the
Yeah.
repeating. So when we provide a consequence and we don't teach the underlying skill, right? So if we say,
Mhm.
all right, you didn't show up with your lunch today, you're not going to eat lunch. We are reinforcing the you didn't have your lunch, so I'm going to give you a consequence. You don't get to eat lunch, right? And then, but I'm not looking at is what's missing to help you remember your lunch. Did you pack a lunch? Did you remember you needed to bring your lunchbox? Did you put your lunchbox on the counter and not put it in your backpack, right? What are the steps underlying in that scaffolding that I need to provide to make sure that I'm getting those skills in place so that it's not just you don't eat lunch, it's okay, how do we teach you to make sure to remember your lunch or at least to carry your some money with you if you need to purchase lunch instead, right? And I think that that sort of leads us into the conversation around, right, how do you collaborate? And I think that this is a big part of the conversation. And I know that we have a short time and I feel like we could talk forever about this kind of thing. But I think starting to think about what a curiosity first collaborative relationship looks like, I don't know where this came from. I say this more often now and I didn't even think about it, but I wanted to put this on a slide because I really believe in the power of words. I think when I was thinking about the title of this presentation, I was thinking about the difference between curiosity and confrontation, only because they feel like polar opposites to me. And so when I think about curiosity, I think curiosity is that building of bridges. When you are wondering together, when you are asking questions, when you're involving each other in solutions, I think that's building bridges. And sometimes the opposite can build walls, right? So, I mean, this is not perhaps my best work, but I loved thinking about it this way. How are we building bridges instead of building walls? And so, what is a curiosity first? And I would start by just saying curiosity doesn't mean letting go of accountability, because I think that's something that comes up often when I say to people, what happens if you get curious? And they say, well, I'm not holding a student accountable. I'm not having a conversation with a teacher that moves things forward. I'm not having a conversation with a parent that holds things. But curiosity doesn't mean letting go of accountability. Curiosity means asking the whys. It means wondering. It means noticing. It means observing. And I think in that way, it speaks to what Emily was saying about that neutrality and subjectiveness, right? And I just like the idea of compassionate curiosity, right? Going into it with a lens of, I see this, I notice this. When you have a conversation with a teacher, so for example, Emily, if you were a teacher and you called me and said, your kid didn't turn in their homework, they forgot their lunch, somehow they're walking home with one shoe on, my first thought would be like, that tracks, right? That tracks. But what I would love is to be able to have a conversation that says, what else did you notice that today? You know, were they particularly unfocused? Were they particularly distracted? Was there something different about the routine? And I would love for a teacher to say to me the same thing. Was there something different at home today? What should I know about your child's day? I will often say to parents, if it's a tough day, just send me an email with that in the subject line. Been a tough morning at home. I don't need any more explanation. I just need to know that so I can approach a child with a different perspective. How else are we building bridges, Emily?
Well, you talk about this, and I think part of it is the curiosity about what's going on with our kids. I think
Hmm.
sometimes we make assumptions that we kind of know our kids and can guess what's going on. But I always encourage folks, like when we're talking to our kids and when we approach it with curiosity, we're actually empowering them to do some self-reflection, some self-evaluation,
Hmm.
and hopefully that will lead to some self-regulation. The other piece, though, about curiosity, specifically when we're working with schools, is I, I I don't know, something came up recently in another presentation I was doing, and this came up, and we were just talking about how kids do well if they can. I think people do well if they can, and I think
Mm.
that extends to educators and to teachers. And sometimes they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what best practices are for working with neurodivergent kids because, as somebody else put in the chat here too, we often parent the way we were parented, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of teachers teach the way they were taught. And so there is, and it's always amazing to me how, it's like I went into the classroom and I was teaching, and I'd had one class during my undergrad on education of the exceptional child. And during that 16-week class, we had one chapter on various disabilities. There was one
Yeah.
chapter of giftedness in there, but it was like, and that was all I got. And we had no classes on like behavior management or anything like that to in any way that was really useful. And so when we approach schools and when we're trying to advocate for our kids, we can ask questions like, well, what have you tried that's worked? Or how have, what are you noticing? Like Amanda was talking about, and just trying to um, approach it in a way that, again, doesn't feel confrontational, and giving educators a chance to kind of meet us halfway. Because again, I do believe that educators want to do that, but there are many different reasons that might get in the way of that. But hopefully you can find some folks who are willing to hear you, to be curious with you, to try some things, just do a little bit of trial and error to see what might work, to go out on a limb for a different accommodation that maybe they haven't tried before, because there's no prescriptive way to support a neurodivergent kid. When you try to rely on prescriptive processes, you are going to fail because every kid is so different.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's super important. And I think part of what we're talking about here is curiosity versus confrontation, right? And I don't love the word confrontation because even the word confrontation makes me feel uneasy, right? But I really want to sort of break this down a little bit and give these practical components of things, right? When we're curious, we're sharing observations and not accusations. I think it's very easy, especially when we are all pressed for time, we are worried about a child, right? To be able to take a step back and not point fingers, not say, I need you to fix this, or this is a problem, or this is something that like, this is a parenting issue, this is a teaching issue, this is, I think being able to share an observation and say, so I'm noticing that it's harder for your child to keep up in class. Can you tell me more about what I need to know about them? And that's that I notice language, right? It's not your child always is late or your child always, it's an I notice kind of thing. Listening for those strengths. I say in teacher language, but I think in parent language too. Asking parents, what does your child do really well? Asking teachers, what have you noticed my child do really well? And reframing from the fact that, you know, we're not asking when as teachers, when we talk to parents, I think making sure that we are not giving the impression that we're asking them to solve a problem for us, and parents making sure that we're not asking teachers to solve the problem for us, that together we are trying to solve for a need. We are trying to solve for something that needs more support and make sure that we are really keeping that student in the forefront of our minds. Also, folks, I am noticing the typo on the slide and it is bothering me, and I'm going to say it out loud.
I knew you wouldn't be able to let that go.
Yes,
You have
I
to,
was,
we just have to recognize it and call it out and just go, listen, I do see it there. And so
I do
I
see
do
it there.
see it there, get it,
Yeah.
see what I did there. Okay.
I'm,
I
yeah.
ha
Go ahead,
I was
Emily.
just gonna
Yeah.
say, I have a
Sorry,
confession.
I don't understand.
Siri apparently wanted to chime in on that too. Okay.
Oh, because I said yeah, okay.
Yep.
Anyway, so talking about this collaboration piece. So my youngest is in 5th grade and he is neurodivergent. He's ADHD, and we have a really rough time every year at the beginning of the year. I think of his now 6 years of school, we've had a meeting with the teacher within 2 to 3 weeks of the new school year, at least 4 of them. And I don't quite know what that is. It's the transition, it's the expectation, it's fear of failure, some perfectionism, like not having the rapport built. But I got an email late last week from the teacher that said, I made Trevor a behavior chart, which if you know me, those are the exact wrong words to say to me because I have very strong opinions about behavior charts. Because again, it goes back to this compliance piece where it's like it might get you short-term compliance, but it's not going to actually teach any skills. And so I replied back. I was not rude, but I was direct.
You
And
were
I said,
restrained. Yes.
yes. And I said, I don't think this is the best way to help Trevor. When can we meet, basically? And I gave a little bit more explanation. I don't think this is helpful for him as far as like building long-term self-regulation skills and being able to, actually be able to do the things that we want and need him to do in school. And so, I said, when can we meet? So we met on Tuesday. And I confess, this is the first time I've ever done this. I've never done it before, but I did bring a copy of one of my books along with me to give to this teacher and just say, here are the exact pages that I would like for you to look at as we rethink how we're approaching this. And the school counselor was in there, who I've known since my oldest was at that same elementary school. It's so hard to advocate for your kids in general. I always say it's so much easier to advocate for other people's kids, for me to be an advocate for other families. I think also I was like, I asked my husband as we were walking in, and I had this copy of this book. I'm like, do you think, is this presumptuous for me to bring this? He goes, yeah. I said, "Oh, I'm doing it anyway." But but the meeting went well. And I really did try to approach it as in like, this is just a tool that I am trying to, I think will be a better fit, not only for my kid, but for other kids. And I've been doing this a while, but we can offer those resources and those tools and hopefully do it in a way that doesn't. I think the meeting went well with all of that said,
Yeah.
even though it was really uncomfortable. I think, at least for me, it was, and I'm sure it probably was for the teacher and the counselor on some level as well.
Yeah. And I think that resources like this webinar even are a great way to say, I saw this, I was thinking of you. I wonder if this would be helpful to you. Now I just plugged our webinar, but also, right, there are ideas, there are other people's chats, or, all of this conversation. Those are really good ways to start those conversations. I think in reverse too. I think parents sharing resources that they found are helpful and teachers sharing resources with parents that they think might be helpful. One of the things that I have loved seeing this year, and I'm just gonna, shout out my teachers that I supervise. I have seen so many proactive, positive, I want to tell you all of the really cool things I've seen about your child. Emails go home in the first couple of weeks of school. And I know how genuine they are, right? They are genuine. And what that's doing is building that opportunity to have that collaboration. And so just kudos to those teachers and to all the other teachers who are doing that and building that relationship. And I think it can go both ways too. I think parents can reach out and say, I know you're busy. I know it's a tough time of year for you. I just want to let you know, like, this is what I have appreciated about your communication. This is what or even to say, when is the best time to get in touch with you so that they know when it is time to build collaboration. I'm going to skip a couple of slides here because I want to make sure we have time. And so I think part of what we're talking about here is how do you affirm at home and in school? And, we've talked a lot about that, using that shared language of strengths, talking about what students do well, reframing some of that deficit based, and also complementing the deficit based with strength based, having a shared respect for the identity of your student, of your child, and that the fact that they have autonomy, right? If we don't have a child's buy-in, we may not be doing the best thing for them because they are being talked about and not talked with. Providing consistency and expectations. I always love when my children's teachers would send home the expectations of what their classroom is, because then I can sort of reinforce it, especially if they're providing very specific language that they're using in the classroom. I can adopt that language at home, and then they're hearing the same language across contexts. And then solving in collaborative ways, right? And I think that all of us being here tonight shows that we're willing to start thinking about. But I think I want to go back to the autonomy piece, because I think this matters a ton when we talk about kids. We talk about kids, right? And Emily, I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about what happens when we leave kids out of that conversation. Because when we're building bridges, we can build bridges between teachers and parents. But where do those kids sit on that bridge? And I would love, I'd love if you kick us off on your thoughts on this.
Yeah, self-advocacy is such an important piece. And we talk about it really often about needing kids to self-advocate. They need to ask for help. They need to know what their accommodations are. I think often the piece that is missing is that self-advocacy is really hard. I would challenge everybody who's here right now. Think about the last time that you had to self-advocate for something. It probably felt somewhat uncomfortable. It was probably in a situation where there may have been a power differential between yourself and the person you were self-advocating to, or some sort of relationship that it requires vulnerability to self-advocate. There's a risk there that you're saying something that you need and they might not respond in a way that's positive. And we put this on neurodivergent kids all the time and say, well, why didn't you ask for help? Why didn't you do this? The thing that we as parents and as educators really need to do is we need to make sure that we are opening the door for self-advocacy, that we are inviting self-advocacy, that we are giving opportunities for it. Tell me what you think might help. Or let's brainstorm some ideas here about what might work. Or if we're talking about self-advocating with a teacher at school, on the one hand, sometimes we can do that for them, but we do kind of need to work on passing the torch. So maybe the first time we're self-advocating and we're scaffolding, we're going in with our child and we're talking together and we're maybe doing more of the talking. And then maybe the next time, we're writing an email, but we're sending it from our email address. Then we
Mhm.
send it from the child's email address. Then they go into school and, they're the ones who are giving the teacher a note themselves or having a conversation piece that they really are approaching that in that way. And so, but we have to recognize that that's not as easy as it sounds, but it is coachable, it is a skill, but we just need to make sure that we're providing those opportunities.
Yeah. And Jackie in the chat just got to my next point, which is like listening, right? We need to be listening
Mhm.
to what our kids are saying. I think part of the thing about self-advocacy that I think about more and more lately, right? Because like you, Emily, I'm realizing it's not as easy as it sounds. And I think it's not, I think even just teaching what advocacy is, I think being able to say to kids, what we're asking you to do is speak up for what's going to help you, right? And speaking up is hard. And so giving kids different ways to speak up, right? Can they show you what they need? Can they tell you what they need? Can they have options to choose from of what they need? But being able to show them that this is a safe place for them to express that. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that self-advocacy, teaching self-advocacy to students really requires us as parents and educators to let go of some things and to be able to listen and respond to the self-advocacy. I think there's a piece of this where when we ask students to self-advocate, when we ask our kids to self-advocate, we have to be prepared for the fact that they might advocate for things that we don't really like very much, or that we don't want them to do, or we don't agree with. But we can't ask them to self-advocate and then say, nah, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to work. I don't think that that's a great idea, or that doesn't match with sort of what I was hoping you would say. So I think being able to realize that when we teach kids self-advocacy, we need to be able to teach ourselves the ability to say, I need to let them try something. I need to let them try. I need to listen. I need to identify the ways that I can make this work within the system that I'm in, or within the classroom that I'm in, or within the home that I'm in, right? For example, I moved to California from Maine when it was 40 below and snowing in Maine, and my son advocated to go to school in shorts. I couldn't actually agree with that, right? Because it was a safety issue. But what I could say is, I hear that you want to wear shorts. Can you wear them over sweatpants or something like that? And then how can I make that work? But being able to say, sometimes your self-advocacy is going to be met with alternatives, right? Or Just sometimes I might say no as a knee-jerk reaction and then have to walk that back and say, actually, I need to think about that because you did speak up for what you need. So I just think there are so many things that go into self-advocacy. And when you're working parents and teachers together, there's a component where you all have to be having communication between each other, because if a student is self-advocating at school for something that a parent is not, not hearing at home, I think it's really important for us to be able to say, like, you know what? Your kid came to me and today and said, I need a break. I need to walk around the school for a minute. And that small win was a big thing, right? Or for a parent to say, my child came home and said to me, I'm exhausted. I don't have the energy to do my homework tonight. And as a parent, I respected that. But just that communication part, somebody just jumped into the chat and said exactly what I was going to say, is that communication is key. That two-way communication is key. And I know that we have been talking for quite some time.
Mm.
Emily, do you have last points you want to make before we open it up to questions?
No, I think I don't know that I have anything else specifically to add. I feel
Yeah,
like we've had a good conversation. I've enjoyed watching the chat, but
me too.
I think I'm okay with heading over to do some Q&A for the last 10 minutes or so.
I think that's great. Charlene, let's bring us back in for Q&A if that's okay.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda and Emily, for that wonderful conversation. And thank you, everybody. What a great chat session. So supportive of one another, lots of really good information and observations. That is really why we're here. And fortunately, I also want to say that the next event in this Neurodiversity Education Series is on agency and autonomy in neurodivergent kids. So please do turn in for that with Dr. Bill Stixard and Ned Johnson. So again, lots of great questions. Let's see what we can do in 10 minutes, okay?
Sure.
First of all, I just want to start by asking, what is the best way for neurodivergent learners? No, I'll rephrase that. How do neurodivergent learners want teachers and parents to lean into their strengths? You've talked a lot about how that communication needs to be a two-way street, but how do the learners, the kids themselves, want it to go down?
I mean, I think what learners need first is for us to help them identify that they have strengths, right? Because a lot of our neurodivergent learners know all of the things they don't do well.
Mhm.
They are very aware of what they struggle with. They are very aware of what is hard for them. But helping us, I mean, us helping them identify what they're really good at is the first way to have those conversations. I'm realizing that leaning into strengths means we have to help kids learn what they do well too. And realizing that it's not always just academic things, right? Kids who do well at sports, kids who do well at music, kids who do well at all of these, like, you can be I mean, I've seen kids who like can flower arrange in like the most amazing ways. That strength is not something I have, right? So to be able to recognize that there are strengths and to point them out to students is that first component for me.
That's really lovely, Amanda. I knew an independent studies teacher, and I never forgot what she said. She said to me, no child ever comes to school to fail.
I love that.
And I just think it's really important for us all to remember that every day, right, with the kids that we interact with, both at home and school. All right, now we're going to go into the speed dating portion of the event here. We've got lots of really good questions. Some of them are complex, but let's just see how we can do, okay? First, question is about supporting a teen with PDA. Can you talk about more supports for teens with a PDA profile, especially those in school refusal or homeschool?
Yeah, it's tricky. And I think the key component with PDAers, we know, is that autonomy, that feeling like there's control there. The thing that I would, it, and that's so easy to say it that way. Um, we have had a couple of really great episodes on the Neurodiversity podcast, both about PDA. We did one also on school avoidance with Dr. Emily King. And so if you wanted to go and check out the Neurodiversity podcast, you could search for PDA or school avoidance, and those would come up. I think that um, when I've worked in the schools specifically with PDA kids, having a safe person at that school that they know that they can go to makes a huge difference, right? Somebody who can meet them at the door as they're coming in, somebody who they can go to if they're feeling dysregulated. And the biggest, thing I wish that more educators, it's so tricky because it's different for different kids and it's hard to know who's dealing with what. But when teachers push PDA kids too much, it damages that relationship so much. It makes it very difficult to recover from that. And there's this whole idea of like, go slow to go fast. Amanda, was that something that was in a meeting or something that we were in recently? I don't know. This came up in a recent conversation
I think
somewhere, but it's
Dr.
like,
Emily King said it to us, actually.
that's right. I was
Yeah.
like, I'm like, I heard it somewhere, but it's like, you have to go slow in order to be able to go faster later. And the time that you feel like you lose as far as instructional time when you are going slow at a kid's pace and making them feel safe and letting them have some sense of control, you will get back in multiples later on down the line when they know they're not going to be pushed past their limit and that they're going to be able to have the resilience and the tolerance to handle those types of situations. So that's a very short answer to a very big question, but yeah, I understand how tricky that can be.
Thank you, Emily. Here's a comment I just had to read because I have to read it. How, when, and why did humanity design a system that works for just a part of the population?
I feel like my answer to that is I know, right?
What else can we say? Okay, we've got lots of questions in just a few minutes. Let's have at it. Here's one from a community advocacy organizer in a large school district. She asks, what would you recommend for one key step for a school system to implement that would be impactful and relatively low-hanging fruit?
Language. Honestly, I think changing language is the first part, is like, how are we talking about the students we want to be supporting? Because changing that language, as Emily said, changes mindset. It is low hanging fruit and it may seem like it doesn't matter very much, but it matters a ton. How we talk about our kids shapes how we see our kids, shapes how we support our kids.
Here's
Thank
the
you.
other thing that I would answer that I would add to that though is when we talk about accommodations, ask the question, what is the goal or the learning objective of this task? And if the accommodation doesn't get in the way of that, allow the accommodation. So often we have educators who give this knee-jerk reaction like, no, we can't make that accommodation, basically because they've never done it before, or they're like, well, that's just not the way I do this activity. So for example, like with collaboration, you might have a learning goal for an activity that is about collaborating with your peers. And so in that situation, there might need to be some supports about like helping somebody maybe who has slower processing speed and structuring that conversation in a way and accommodating that student so that they aren't feeling like they're getting lost in the conversation. But other times, if the goal of the activity has nothing to do with collaboration and you're just doing it that way because the kids maybe like it or whatever, if that student would rather work independently, let them work independently. And so when you have, if you're questioning an accommodation, boil it down to that question. What is the goal of this learning? And does the accommodation allow the student to still achieve that goal? And if so, give them permission to do that.
Mm.
Thank you, Emily and Amanda. Really good advice. Really good advice. All right, here's a question that I think many parents who are on tonight can empathize with. This writer asks, how can I support my ADHD daughter during homework? I don't know how I can help her move through the load without getting too distracted or focusing on perfectionism on the parts that don't matter.
There are a couple of things I would start with. The first is asking your daughter how she would like to start it. Would she like to start with the easiest stuff or the hardest stuff, right? Because giving them choices as to like what they want to get through first is being able to like help them sort of organize the homework that they have. Do you want to do easy things first? Are there things that are more challenging for you? The second thing is realizing like for some kids, doing it all in one chunk of time doesn't work, right? So being able to be willing to say, I know this isn't going to work for you. Why don't you take a break, come back to it, set a timer, have a snack, those kinds of things. And also realize like some kids are are stuck on certain pieces, and to acknowledge that, like, it sounds like you're really stuck here. Let's try something else for a little bit, and then we can come back to this task and see if we can approach it with a different perspective. I'm talking really fast because I know we're trying to get through so many questions. I'm
Yeah,
sorry. Yeah.
yeah. And again, we only have a few minutes, but I do want to ask this question because it's a really good one. The parent asks, how can we respond when schools say academic performance is great when our neurodivergent kids are struggling to get through the day and need accommodations so that masking isn't mandatory?
So the easiest answer here is the fact that academic performance is not a requirement for accommodations. So when students qualify for an individualized education program, I always like to say plan, but it is program for IEP. I learned that when Amanda and I wrote this book, I think. Anyway, I think a lot of people say plan. I digress. But in that situation, you do have to show academic impact in order to qualify for an IEP. For a 504 plan, though, what the law says is that it is about something that impacts a major life activity. So that could be thinking, focusing, concentrating, what reading, overall well-being, and any of those types of things can be a major life activity. And so when they try to default to that, it really is about saying, these are the things that are happening, bringing the child in and helping them advocate and say, these are the things I'm experiencing. Quick little anecdote. I had a student who was doing very, very well in some AP classes in the high school level, but she was so stressed out that she was experiencing suicidal ideation and she was cutting. And we went to the school to ask for accommodations, and the administrator tried to tell us, well, her grades are fine and we don't see the problem here at school. That is not how you determine if something is substantially impacting one of those major life activities. And so we advocated for it and we did get some accommodations, but sometimes even administrators don't really understand that difference. And so you may need to have some tools and some resources in your back pocket to support that.
Which is a good point. I'm just going to really plug the fact that I wrote a book called The Everything Parents Guide to Special Education, which might be a really good resource for you to have on hand for that situation.
Well, Emily and Amanda, we have come to the end of this amazing hour together, and I just really want to thank you both. Bev and I recently talked to a superintendent who said, we said, what is the one thing that you would ask parents to do? And she said, come to us with curiosity.
Yeah.
Come to us with curiosity. And I think you two have done that in such a beautiful way tonight to try to help with that school parent dynamic. So thank you both. I want to give each of you a few seconds for some final words. Amanda, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, no, I didn't know you were going to start with me.
Well,
I think, but thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you. And thank you for everybody who joined, because I know it's hard to do on a Wednesday night. I'm looking at my calendar to see what it is,
It's
but
the
it's Thursday.
Thursday.
It's Thursday. I know I didn't change my calendar. I think my final thoughts are just keeping that curiosity mindset, but knowing that you're not always going to get it right is okay, right? Small steps, trying. Trying is what we ask of our students, is what we ask of our kids, and it's all that we're asking of you right now, is to try something different.
thank you, Amanda. Great final words. Emily, back to you.
No, I just thank everybody, yeah, like Amanda said, for being here. I've gone all week thinking that it's a day ahead, so Amanda thinks it's a day behind. So between the two of us, we showed up on the right day, which is good. Um, no, I just want to validate the fact that it's hard and it changes. And the minute you think you've got it figured out, it'll change again. And that's okay. And it doesn't reflect on you as a parent or your child as a person either. And we're all going to get through it one way or the other, even on the days that it feels really hard.
Well, thank you, Amanda Morin and Emily Kircher-Morris, for a brilliant conversation. And thank you all for being on tonight. All the great questions, all the great comments. We hope to see you at our next event in October. So take care, everybody. Good night for now. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.